All right, so welcome to the last session of the day. This is session 19A, and Jim Short, who's led a couple of other really good discussions so far, is going to talk to three of his colleagues who come from different backgrounds and things to talk about how open data and the data economy can benefit from looking at public and private models to incentivize data sharing. Jim, I'll let you take it away. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. So good day, everyone. We're at a next to last session at a couple of days at this year's MIT CDOIQ. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the committee. I'm part of the chair group. And also just for those of you in different time zones in Europe or in Asia, thank you for staying up late. Thank you for getting up early. Whatever your immediate time zone may be, to join us at a last session. It's been a long couple of days, but I think we've all enjoyed it, and we'll try to be very tight and judicious of our time and fast-paced in this final session. So let me just set the context, and then I will introduce my co-moderator, Dr. Pieter Leenheer, and our distinguished two guests, Dr. Chaitan Baru and Dr. Tom Haegemans. The context here is over the course of the last 2 days, there have been a lot of discussions about open data and indeed data sharing. This is a topic that has obviously gained considerable attention. It's not a new one. People have been sharing data for a long time. Any of you in physics or in chemistry or in science-based healthcare organizations have been sharing data at some level for a very long time. So part of what we'll discuss today is whether the existing long-standing models for data sharing will scale in some way to this notion of public or open data, and try to understand a little bit about what progress we could make on describing that from several points of view. One, from a partnership basis. A lot of people have referred to this idea of partnership. What does that mean? A second is the technologies themselves. Are we entering a technology environment which facilitates this in a way that was more difficult 20 years ago when the physics community, for example, started sharing lots of data? If you talk to someone from CERN, they would tell you that they have been sharing data for a very long period of time, and so forth and so on. So the question then becomes, what's different? How do we leverage the new opportunities we have for this type of idea? And how can we build organizationally and funding models, which Dr. Baru will talk a little bit about from the Science Foundation point of view, to facilitate it? So let me introduce my co-moderator, Dr. Pieter Leenheer, no stranger to the idea of data sharing. Pieter, you want to say hello, and then we'll introduce both Chaitan and Tom and get going.
Yes, hello. I'm really excited to be here again, and thanks, Jim, also for inviting me to be part of this panel.
So, thank you, Pieter. Thank you. And Pieter will be interviewing. We have kind of an armchair format here. We are not going to do slides, so that is the good news to everyone out there who's been looking at a couple of days worth of slides. And we will try to organize this around a set of specific topics, ideas, and case studies. So with pleasure, I'd like to introduce a colleague, Dr. Chaitan Baru at the National Science Foundation, on leave from the Supercomputer Center, so we miss him. Chaitan, would you like to say hello to the group? And we'll turn to our substantive discussion here in a second. So just as an introduction.
Yes, hi. Hello to everyone. Thank you, Jim, for inviting me to this session to close out the conference, I guess.
Indeed. And I'd also like to introduce Dr. Tom Haegemans. Tom, thank you very much. You're bringing some expertise in an area that you have both looked at as a doctoral candidate and as someone with a PhD in a related area, and also from the point of view of developing a partnership-based company, which is looking at this. So Tom, do you want to say hello to people, and then we'll get rolling?
Hey everyone, thanks for the invite, Jim. Very excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. All right, well, let me just say a few words and then we'll start right into our discussion. As I said at the beginning, this concept of open data is a very important one. And let's just start with three premises. And we have discussed these beforehand and we'll pick them up. The first presentation or conjecture certainly is that data's never been free. So the concept of data being able to be exchanged in open formats has always carried with it the concept of how do you make or design and incentivize the sharing of data that has all other sites of attributes associated with it. Obviously, who owns the data, who has created the data, ownership, quality, so forth and so on. We have a large number of data professionals. Many of you have worked with data for your lifetimes, for many, many years. You know all of the attributes. We could all collectively list 30, 20, or even more. So the question then becomes, what are the characteristics of this notion of open? We all understand the general premise, which is that we can do more things if we have more people involved in the use of data. But the question then becomes, how are those roles defined and what kinds of data we're talking about? The second general premise is that in a previous session talked a lot about who's actually going to offer open data and who's going to manage this. Is this a private activity? Are companies going to all of a sudden decide that they can provide these platforms on a commercial setting? Is this an intrinsically partnership-based activity where commercial organizations are going to partner with government? Or in the case of an earlier session, which looked at this earlier in the day, is this primarily a government function? The US is not new to that. We had Data.gov. We can all have decisions about how successful an activity that has been. During the Obama administration, we had a chief data architect, analyst person in place. So the question then becomes if this is a government activity, well, I'll just speak in the US context, there's a lot of government in the US. So where's the point of the sphere if we're talking about open? Who's going to be the open? Who's going to do that? So I think with that context, and that is a simple set of questions, I'd like to pass the baton to Tom Haegemans, who's actually built an environment and is looking to build a partnership structure around that. So Tom, I'm going to give you the first easy question to address, which is, how have you approached this question? What guardrails have you put around this very broad topic in your own work? So Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, so first of all, I'm co-founder of a company that's specialized in personal data ecosystems. So basically what we do is we set up digital ecosystems for our customers, and we specialize in personal data. So my specialty, my area of expertise is in personal data. So data about people. So there are several trends that I see that are turning or that make that several organizations turn to sharing personal data with each other. But before I go over them, let me first talk about ownership of private data, because that's something different. Because if you talk about personal data, then you also have the data subject that is involved. So in this case, ownership of personal data is popular, but it's often misunderstood. So it's not because the data is about you that you own the data. So even if the data is about you, then the owner might be some other organization, like, for example, the government that stores data about you. So I see three trends actually that our customers, or at least that I think that make our customers are interested in opening up their personal data. So first of all, there's becoming a hype around digital ecosystems. Also technical standards like the SOLID standard invented by Tim Berners-Lee in the last few years that are making a movement or setting up a movement in which organizations are looking towards opening up their personal data. But also, for example, organizations starting to see the light that they can actually create value by sharing data. And not only governments, but also private organizations, they can in fact generate value and also capture that value if they share data. And lastly, we see also a huge impact of legislation, like for example in Europe, the GDPR, and so on.
Thanks, Tom, for that overview. So we're talking about data, and we're kind of throwing it all on the same pile, right? Whether the data is the raw material, right? As observed, your name, address, typical PI. But then, of course, you have all the derived assets from that, right? So I think you point also that ownership lies into who controls the processing of the data, which turns it into another form, right? GDPR was a lot about personal data like PII, which is very tabular, right? Very two-dimensional. But Chaitan, maybe you can help us enlighten a bit how the data is also evolving into more complex forms, right? Like, for example, genetic sequencing information that we are now all kind of collecting in the 23andMe and the ancestries. But that also now that privacy regulations are actually inhibiting free research on genetic information, thanks to or unthanks to GDPR. Could you maybe enlighten a bit how you see it from the scientific or research point of view, how important it is to look at data in its different dimensions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. So I think, considering that this is a meeting of the chief data officers, we are actually entering a very complex environment, or a very complex frontier, I would say. Jim earlier referred to physics data sharing and so on. So so for those of you who might, probably nobody here is that old, but I am. Look, if you look at my beard and my hair. If you look at the origins of the internet, it's very, very closely tied to physics discoveries and so on because of CERN and Tim Berners-Lee. And some of the early applications on the internet were things like Gopher and FTP. Now, who remembers FTP now? File transfer protocols, right? So it was actually about sharing data. People thought, oh, this vast international computer network could be used for transferring files. So we come from there to where we stand today, where there's just enormous amounts of data, and people say things like data is the oil and data is the new thing and so on. But Peter, like you said, what does it all mean in terms of the ability to share and the ability to protect privacy, the ability to protect intellectual properties associated with the data itself and so on? So where I would start, even coming from the scientific world, but it's actually it's another thing where the scientific world is crashing with the commercial world when it comes to data, is this notion of, over the last couple of years, this term FAIR, FAIR, has gained some prominence, which is that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I think a lot of this starts with the R part, the reusable. So basically what's happening, whether it's science or commerce, is all of a sudden people are finding that the data that I collected for one purpose is actually now extremely valuable for another purpose. And that's actually how the whole notion of big data started. The big data notion was you take the so-called exhaust from things. So maybe these are shopping transactions that you just got out of point of sale terminals, and all of a sudden people figured out that, oh my God, if I look at the point of sale terminal transactions, I can actually find out relationship between products, that somebody who buys X is also buying Y. Now, if I know that, I can go and put X and Y next to each other on the on the shop shelf, so that I increase the sales. Or I advertise Z so that when you're buying X and Y, you also buy Z and so on. So who thought that you would take transactions like this and actually drive it for a completely different purpose? Coming back to science, now this is what is happening in science. Why is it causing a revolution? Well, because in scientific enterprise, it's still by and large the case that scientific data had been collected based on an experiment and for very specific purposes. So if I'm collecting ecological data in a particular region, It's because of a science experiment I designed, and I want to study something in that region. There's a whole lot of justification. So in order to reuse it, if you are another ecologist, you know all the what we call metadata about it, so you know how to reuse it. Same thing with physics, chemistry, etc., genetics. But now all of a sudden, as there's more and more data and we're able to connect data sets together, so that ecological data is maybe connected to the topographic data, maybe it's connected to the atmospheric data. And then all of these connections start happening. Atmospheric data was collected for a different reason, right? Topography may have been collected for yet another experiment, but people are wanting to connect all of these things together. So now we come into a world where data that had different provenance, different reason for being collected is all being put together. I'm talking about this as if it's a science problem, but the same problems occur in commerce. The same problem occurs in business. So I think that's where we are starting from. That's why I think it's kind of a bit of a frontier right now. Earlier in one of the sessions I attended, they talked about, actually it was just the previous session, Databricks was talking about the reason you should go for open platforms is because the world is changing so quickly. So if you go to closed platforms in a couple of years, your platform might be out of date. Think of the same way about data. So one point I want to make here, which is something at the National Science Foundation where I'm right now, we're also talking about, is data as infrastructure. Again, it's a very fundamental concept. Until now, data was the output of an experiment, or the data was an output of a business process that you did and it happened to generate data. Now you think about data is the infrastructure. That's sort of the notion of saying data is oil, right? It's actually the thing on which you're going to base a lot of your work or a lot of your profit. In that case, why do you want data to be open? Well, because if the data is open, it's then well understood, and then you can build more things on top of it. If the data is closed, it's very hard to trust it. You don't know where it's coming from. You can't do things like provenance. You can't trust, all the trust relationships. So you can say the same thing about genetics. I mean, I'll stop here. We can get into discussion about limited and private sharing versus more open sharing and so on. Yes, there are going to be boundaries here between what is more private versus what is more open. And that's where all the complexities arise. I think I'll stop with that for now.
Should I pick up, Jim?
We're on the flight path for the Navy. We had an F-18 flying overhead, so I went on mute for a brief time. Chaitan, thank you. One of the things we want to do here is to take the general and move to the specific, where there has been an accumulated body of experience, and probably, as Tom had mentioned and as Pieter has been involved with personally, the area in many respects that is very advanced in the open concept as a government policy question, of course, is the European Union and GDPR, which has been looking at this for some period of time. So I'd like to turn this back to Pieter and to Tom, who can take us through the European context, and then we'll come back to Chaitan to look at how the North American context is either similar or different, and what the two environments can learn from each other. So Pieter, back over to you.
I know. Well, thanks, Chaitan. Really liked your comment about the move from data, where the value in the data lies in the transaction, and the data set, a very static thing, towards what you call infrastructure, which is basically valuing data in use, right? It's a bit kind of a shift like the software business did, right? As a service, right? As a subscription. And make sure you also follow certain service level agreements and be able to track them down. There's definitely some fascinating technologies today that allow you to really do real-time tracking and prediction of where data will be moving to. So that's interesting. But now, yeah, back to the whole idea, of course, of legal frameworks and policy frameworks within businesses around data sharing, data reuse. I think it's all clear. Everybody in this room is probably involved in a business that is global, right? That you deal with United States and you at least, and have to deal with different data-related frameworks, right? The GDPR, for example, in Europe, CCPA in California. Of course, in the States, you have more state-driven initiatives before it becomes an overall law. But what is interesting about GDPR is that it does not only restrict to whom or for what the data flows to, right? It doesn't only restrict the who and the what, but it also states very strict requirements for data quality, right? It states requirements for data rectification and the right to be forgotten. Really makes very clear requirements for data quality. And I do know that, Tom, you, of course, I actually did meet you 3 years ago at MIT ICIQ when I was keynoting there and you were presenting. So I still find the element of data quality and the concept that is now evolving in the context of data as a service very intriguing, right? Because it's not just a static transactional measurement anymore, right? It's a measurement over time, over use, right? Now, of course, the EU also comes up with this whole idea on top of the GDPR data framework is the AI guidelines that says something about the restriction of the impacts of the consequences of the derived products, right? Algorithmically or statistically, whatever you derive from base data, decisions, actions, whether it's through human intervention or machine intervention. You're in Europe, you're building that ecosystem out. Can you tell us a bit more, maybe through use cases or different experience? And then we can see how the US is evolving in a different way or similar way.
Absolutely, thanks, Peter. So first of all, everyone knows that GDPR. GDPR is very well known. And among other things, it states, also next to data quality, it also states that organizations should make the data that they have about you available to you so that you can reuse it elsewhere. And it's exactly that data reuse that is a fundamental building block of creating digital ecosystems based upon personal data. Because if you can reuse data from one organization at another, in fact, you are creating a digital ecosystem. But it's not only the GDPR regulation that it's very important. We see with our customers, which are also, for example, governments, that they look at the single digital gateway regulation. And the single digital gateway regulation is like the GDPR regulation in Europe that says that governments should adhere to the once only principle. So that means that you as a European citizen, you should only provide your information once to any of the governmental agencies in the whole of Europe. So that's a very, very challenging requirement, regulation for governments, because all of their data services need to become interoperable and citizens need to be able to reuse their data from one government at another in another member state. So that's a very big problem for those local governments. But besides also the legislation, we see in Europe that there's generally an interest in open data standards, like for example, the solid standard, but also that they're spinning up local initiatives. Like in Flanders, they're setting up a data utility company. So like Chaitan said, data should be the infrastructure on which everything is based. So in Flanders, for example, they see their personal data and personal data stores as some kind of utility that should be offered to citizens in Flanders, so that they can actually reuse data more easily from one party and another. But of course, there's also different use cases, but I don't want to take up too much of your time, because I'm sure that you guys also have some other interesting additions to say.
Well, maybe Chaitan, you want to comment on that? What you see on the state side?
Yeah, so I remember being in a few meetings and even I guess sessions a year ago when COVID started, and these are actually international meetings with folks from Europe, Africa, Asia, and so on. And it was very interesting to see the differences in terms of information policy, data policy in the different parts of the world. And actually, so in some ways, Europe was ahead of the game because they were they already had sort of data policies. In the US, it's still a little bit of a Wild West, right? It's a little bit of everything. So my general comment, I'm not an expert in this. It's at places like NSF, we certainly fund research on privacy and cybersecurity and so on. But a lot of the data that we fund is open scientific data. But my own view on this is, I think some of the things like GDPR, already you've seen the state of California here has adopted those things, after GDPR happened. I wouldn't be surprised if more of those kind of things happen here. And actually, I do think we are entering a period for the next number of years where we're going to see more regimes of policy and so on related to data, even in the US. Just because of all this, well, for two reasons. One, the power of data, as we all have been saying, that just the tremendous power that you can get from analyzing and deriving things out of data. But also the second being whole concern about quality. I mean, this meeting itself is about information quality, right? So it's the quality of data and essentially it's the misinformation and the trust aspects of data have become so problematic in society that I think there will be a reaction. I'd be surprised if there wasn't any. So that's and actually, and I'll just give a quick shout out because there's a bunch of stuff behind my head right now. So I'm actually part of a brand new program at NSF called the Convergence Accelerator. And it's a program that's really about transitioning research into practice. Okay, that's the accelerator concept. We advertise themes on which we request proposals. The themes are put out by NSF. Proposals receive a phase 1 award of up to $750K for 9 months to 12 months to basically prototype their effort, bring together a multidisciplinary team, identify their users, and actually define deliverables. So this is a program not about doing research, but it's actually about delivering products, whatever the products might be, hardware, software, policies, etc. And then in phase 2, projects can get up to $5 million for 2 years to go ahead and actually build it. And there's a requirement of partnerships. It requires university, industry, nonprofit, government, some combination of partnerships because of the need for users and so on. There is an expo of this program next week. So please, you can go and sign up at that URL and attend the expo. We will have about 40 different projects from all of our different tracks. The reason I'm mentioning this is the first couple of tracks were about AI and well, almost all the tracks have data in there, right? How can you do anything today without data? One of them is about quantum computing, though it's actually quantum information systems and they're building some hardware, but some of those projects in the quantum track are about using quantum technologies for machine learning. How do we make it go super fast and make those decisions much faster in real time? But the others are things like Open Knowledge Network, which is very much about data and creating a knowledge infrastructure across all of these data. But the reason I mention it is also one of the tracks that we are just now in the process of selecting the final projects is about misinformation. It's actually called Trust and Authenticity in Communication Systems. Very interesting, extremely multidisciplinary projects bringing together computer science, legal folks, social science, psychology. The use cases there are going from kids, how do you deal with children in schools and basically give them literacy so they understand some of these things, all the way to 65-plus-year-olds. And actually there's a understanding that it's not just 65 plus, there is a stratification of age from 65 to 70, 70, 80, and so on, because how people absorb information actually changes quite a bit as they age over time. So all of this brings us back to this notion of, how do we ensure that we have good quality information especially at a time when we are now beginning to talk about data as infrastructure. We're going to build a whole lot of stuff on top of data. But what is that data? How good is it? How much can you poke it? What is its provenance? How far can you drill down and ask the question, is this good data? Uh, so um, I think that's um, that's one of the points I want to make about quality. Coming back to government services, I just want to quickly mention that in some of these international meetings, and I've been looking at some of what's going on around, it may be turning out that India is actually leading in some of these government offered digital services. So Tom just mentioned about government level services. So India has something called the Aadhaar card, which is single number for every citizen, 1.3 billion numbers to identify the 1.3 billion people. And it has a variety of digital services that industry can actually leverage in order to build things like know your customer kinds of applications that they can actually leverage government services to get a fast start. Now, very different economy and a very different system there. And maybe India is on one side, US is on the other side, and maybe a lot of European systems are kind of in the middle. But it's very interesting to see what government is offering as digital services to actually prop up the next economy, the next kinds of, the next version of the economy that we are going to have, which is an information economy. And one thing that people have observed in India, as things have become super convenient and going much faster than those of us who might have been used to the old India. So that might be a case study to look at.
Chaitan, thank you. I think that, in the continuation of a specific activity underway, a conference at the NSF may be of interest to people in the group here and participating. So listen, we have about 25 minutes left, and we do want to stay on time as one of the final sessions. So I'd like to move this from kind of what I would call a landscape view to some specific ideas that we can discuss, and then we'll turn this to questions. The two ideas are, I'd like to ask, and I'll go first on this to give everybody a little bit of time. Pieter and I have talked about this. Let's all give a 1 or 2 minute summary of some of the issues we have seen in specific cases where people are trying to open up data environments. And so instead of talking about open data, where we're talking about the universe here, let's talk about some specific cases where we have seen, and I'll go first on that. And the second is that we're speaking, as we know, to many chief data officers, or what we would call significant data roles in companies, people that run analytics groups, analysis, data management, data professionals. So the second question we'll ask after we talk about some individual cases is, whose job is this? Is this the CDO role, which of course we're speaking to CDOs. So yes. And then the question becomes, well, if it is a staff level organizational role within a federal agency or corporate environment, and you have limited bandwidth, who are your partners? Who do you go to? Do you go up? You have to get top leadership involved. You have to get people who are actually in the field level who are going to implement it. I use this in management terms. Is this a line manager problem? Who are the people that are going to join you in the effort? So on a case study, I'm going to go into a 1 minute summary about why some of this is critically important in a competitive sense and also extremely difficult. So we're studying a question which Pieter and Tom and yourself have looked at, which is in the environment around maritime supplies, maritime supply of data going across shipping companies. In this case, it was TradeLens, which is a blockchain-enabled shipping manifest document transfer protocol, which is being developed in ports. Here's the 2 or 3 things that we've learned from looking at this. First, the actual system has to sit within an existing stack. So there is a big problem of integration across all the existing data environments that shipping companies and port innovation so forth and so on. So there's a very complicated port management information system environment, of which an open environment, or at least a limited blockchain-enabled permission-based blockchain has to sit within. So there's a massive integration question here. The second is that there's a regulatory question. And some of the regulation in this area is not immediately obvious. Now in the port system, the regulatory agency that got involved very early was the Federal Trade Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission. FTC has to rule on whether you can exchange data, competitive data. Some of this data is considered to be competitive and protected. So in the commercial sense, just like in the public environment and healthcare, there is a wide variety of regulatory provisions with respect to the exchange of data, which may be competitively sensitive. And different regulatory regimes look at that differently. And in fact, if you stripped away the case, and I'll end on this point, there's over 30 different regulatory agencies in the port environment, and those are the immediate ones, where putting in a lateral data exchange activity, whether it's a blockchain enabled or document manifest, transfer data, so forth and so on, lots of people have a view on that. So open data also means substantial compliance related activity that is associated with regulation. So Pieter, you and I have looked at another case. If you want to kind of go through Luna for a second, and then we'll spin it to Tom and Chaitan.
Yes, definitely. Well, we talked a lot about the scientific exploration, right? But we also need to come up here with some real business cases, how companies can make money and turn around what's currently happening with analytics, right? But first of all, if you look now, the number of PhD positions and professor positions at universities today on the topic of data sharing business models is exploding, right? And I'm gonna give Tom also here a words in a minute, but it's also a call for action, right? So if you want to really work on this, I'm actually working now with PhD students also in Brussels on this topic, and they're looking to work with chief data officers who are seeking these business models and the new value streams, right? One specific case is interesting is Luna DNA, a party Jim and I have been working with back in the San Diego area, where is an example of how a company or an industry can really turn around the current bad news about how their products or services are biased towards majority groups. And one specific element there is inclusive medicine. So Luna DNA is an example of a company that organizes a data bank or data cloud, where actually minority groups can group themselves with genetic minority diseases or other problems, and actually convince pharmaceutical companies and also include that in their innovation pipeline, right? So there are ways really for companies to diversify their revenue streams and their innovation streams, by at the same time also resolving that problem of biased customer audiences. Tom, I've known Digita and you for several years. You're looking and you're talking to a lot of chief data officers in Europe, banks, companies, governments. Can you maybe tell us a bit on what you learn in these conversations? What are concrete things our CDOs can take away here?
Yeah, absolutely. So indeed, it's if you have a personal data ecosystem that you want to open up. I mean, the thing is, you have data producers making data available. You have data custodians, so organizations that will store the data, but you also have data consumers, organizations that will use the data. For data consumers, of course, the value of taking outside data in is self-explanatory, but it's always a question: why should I, as an organization, make data available to people so that they can reuse it at other organizations? And to be honest, yeah, let's be honest, legislation is a very boring reason to do so, but we have observed several reasons why organizations make data available to people and to create value. For example, many governments, we notice that they simply want to increase voter satisfaction. So you as a politician, you as a CDO of a government agency, your job is to increase voter satisfaction. And basically, we see that happening in Flanders, for example. They do increase voter satisfaction by making data available so that citizens can reuse their governmental data. So they are really happy with the current policymakers, and they want to vote for those policymakers again. Other customers of ours, they just want to streamline manual processes. For example, we work here in a case in Belgium with notaries that have to exchange deeds with banks. So if you, as a customer of a bank, you get a new home loan, you have to make sure that the deed of your house is enclosed in your home loan file. But that deed is with the notary. It's another organization, and that organization wants to share data with the bank because they just want to streamline those manual processes. And other cases, and like Pieter said, are about increasing revenue streams. So for example, in a bank typically needs to create several documents for a person. For example, whether they are credit worthy, so they have a sufficiently high credit score to get something. They have to create a document that really says you have this kind of credit score or whatever. But of course, those customers of ours, they are thinking about asking money to create those documents, not asking money to end users, but asking money to other organizations that want to verify the authenticity of that credit score, for example. So that's why they are making such data available. So there are many different cases in which making data available or making sure that people are able to reuse the data from your organization really makes a lot of sense. And it's not about legislation, because to be honest, legislation is not always the most important value driver.
Yeah. So just quickly, so I think all of those reasons that Tom has mentioned is what makes all of this very exciting. It's an exciting time to be around because we're thinking of so many new ways of using this. There's new economies. There's an economy based on data that we are saying is going to emerge and so on. Going back quickly to the question that Jim started with, who gets involved? So I mentioned the Open Knowledge Network, which is one of the initiatives that's right now at NSF, and we are looking at cross-agency. How do we use something like the Open Knowledge Network to in fact open up more data and provide access? And it turns out who gets involved is both, in the sense the lower level technical people, but also the higher level people. You need the technical people because that's where the real understanding of the data is. It's the people who are close to the data who can actually tell you how good is this data, what data do we have, what can we share, how much will it cost to do this, and so on. At the same time, because we are in a sort of a frontier environment, you need the senior people involved, both to make the policy decisions, because there are no clear policies. We actually might need to break new ground in that, but also to give the assurance that, it's back to the quality. What happens if somebody finds something bad in this data? You don't victimize the low-level tech guy. That has to be a high-level person who makes that decision, saying, okay, I've got your back, right? We're going to make this decision and we'll do it. So you need both. You need that lower and the upper person. The other thing I'm going to say is so how do you do it? I think you do it through use cases. You really need use cases to drive the sharing. But that's actually an interesting tension. We just said data is the new infrastructure. Well, if the interstates were the new infrastructure, it would be like somebody saying, well, before I build the interstate, I want to ask you, what are you going to use this interstate for? What are you going to drive? I mean, you can say, well, what are you going to drive on it? Interstates are designed for a certain level of loading and so on. But nobody says, what are you actually using it for? But here we are saying we should ask that question because what the data is going to be used for, that's your use cases, are actually going to drive some of the initial implementations. So it's kind of an interesting tension. If it's infrastructure, why do you need to know what I'm going to use it for? Yeah, well, we need to know that because that's how we're going to build this out. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this progresses.
Yeah, Chaitan, exactly. You make a very good point. I think we are doing the same thing with the use cases approach. but indeed, the point that you're noting, we also encountered it. So it's like a chicken or an egg problem, but still we're
Yeah,
convinced that the use case
because like otherwise it becomes a build it and they will come kind of thing, right? I just put my data out, so what? I mean, nobody's using it. And then people say, you published your data, nobody's using it. Well, because there was no use case.
Exactly.
All
I
right.
think many companies have
Thank
the
you.
fear of missing out by not collecting enough data, right? Rather than really setting a future state of the company and collecting data around what they need, right? I really go deep on that in order to, we come back to quality and infrastructure. In order for a company to become a data infrastructure that clicks in and with a high quality service into the rest of the business ecosystem, and not collecting data about which they don't know much, because most data is not used anyhow. But Jim, I'm going to give over to you for some final comments.
Yeah, I think so, gentlemen. Thank you. I think we should move to the chat line to see if we want to address if we have any questions to address. So, if we can go to full screen with all of us present, let's do that and see if we have some questions.
Jim, I'm so sorry to report there just aren't any at this point. We have about 150 people listening, but they don't seem to have come up with any particular thing. So I'm going to infer that you guys are presenting the material in an absolutely clear and perfect manner, and everybody's getting what you're saying.
I think people
Seriously,
are just
guys.
in shock with the amount of stuff that needs to be done.
Seriously, to our delegates, we do have 5 minutes
is...
left. If you have any questions, please do drop them into the chat, but there's nothing out there right at the moment.
Yeah, I think we can, each of us can offer 1 minute of final comments. That'll be, if anyone has a burning question, please do submit it. So I'll go first on final comments, and guys, let's keep it brief since we're the final session and we want to thank everyone for participating. I think this is a very critical area, and I think that we've tried to explore some of the ideas, and we do have some work and some experience, and we tried to pull together on the panel this notion of some public activities, certainly at my center and at Chaitan, and then some private activities and the partnership that can evolve to move this forward on a kind of partnership basis. I don't think in the public infrastructure, you can be fairly skeptical that this is, at least in this country, is going to move quickly. I believe in some sectors and in some academic environments, it will, because it has to. I think in others, I think we can stay tuned on event activities which will drive further investment in this context. In the casework that I'm working on in this space, the management domain is this notion of ecosystems and ecosystem partnerships, which has a business model organization around it. And we're trying to understand the technologies that support the business models that encourage competitive partnership activities which scale. It's relatively easy to point to partnership opportunities that are not scalable. It's more difficult to look at the ones that are scalable. And I think that's where we're headed. So that's the space that in the research that I'm working on. Pieter, you've been looking at this area for a long time. Do you want to continue with that on this final comments?
Well, I just want to repeat, I think technologists and researchers have to continuously pave the way, trailblaze it forward. And like I said, call for action. If you are a data leader or data worker or chief data officer, and you want to participate in research around data sharing business models, we can definitely connect you with PG students, because they can do a lot of work for you, right? So if it's not an urgent thing, they can do it on the long run and help you build a consensus around that. But I would like to thank Tom for being here so late. It's almost midnight in Brussels, and Chaitan in DC. I assume you're not that far from me. And Jim, thanks for inviting me again, and the whole MIT CDOIQ organization. Thank you.
Tom, any last any last comments that you'd like to make?
Yeah, thanks for the invite. It was very nice to be here again. But sadly, it was virtual. But thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts.
Chaitan, same question. Any final comments? You can talk a little bit about your upcoming conference. I think that looks will be of interest to people here.
Yeah, actually, first I want to say, since this is a data conference, this is, I mean, I know the world is full of challenges right now. Our society is facing so many challenges, but this is an exciting time to be alive as a data person. There's just so many interesting things going on. So enjoy the ride. The last thing I want to say is we have a new director at the National Science Foundation who is very interested in transitioning research to practice. And this is one of the reasons why we have this Convergence Accelerator program. So any of you, I know there are a lot of industry folks here, please feel free to contact me. We think public-private partnerships are going to be a big, big thing that NSF is going to be doing more and more of. We are just starting. So see Baru at nsf.gov. I mentioned all these projects that you'll be able to see next week in the showcase. We are actively in the business of connecting our projects to industry, other government, nonprofit, etc. So we are very hands-on with our projects, and I'd love to connect those folks to you. Already I heard lots of interesting things in this conference that our project should be aware of. So thank you. And thanks you guys for inviting me.
Of course. So I'll just wind up by again thanking everyone who has participated.
Well, Jim, we did get 2 questions in response to our plea, so let me toss them into you. All right.
Okay. Keep us on time, Peter.
Absolutely. First one is from Sabir. It says sharing knowledge behind data (open parentheses metadata close parentheses) to represent the operating model, then applications. Do you see any challenges in cultures across your experience? I'm not quite sure how to parse it. I will drop this also in the chat function. So if you guys want to try to parse the meaning of that.
Exactly. To pick that up.
Well, in the data world, we've talked about the difference between data thinking and application thinking or technology thinking. That may have an issue in there. I'm not sure.
Well, one thing I'll say quickly, and maybe Tom has some thoughts on this as well, is so with this notion of knowledge graphs, which is in a sense a new infrastructure that we're talking about, we actually want to remove that distinction between data and metadata and context. In a way, it should all be captured in a common scheme so that essentially automatically when you're using the data, you get the right kind of context, you get the right kind of metadata. But that's I think for the future. So all this business of completely separating out the metadata from the data, I think that needs to go away.
It's actually all metadata is data, of course, right?
Exactly.
Exactly.
Well,
yeah, I'll just make the quick comment that for the person that I mean, the sharing knowledge question is a critical one, and it's one that's very familiar to people in the science disciplines. So the notion of what we're talking about sharing, which we didn't, today was to kind of get the topic going and to get it moving. And a concluding notion here is, first of all, I appreciate the question and understand the context I believe that the person has. Where I would look at that in the specific context for a period of time that people have addressed that obviously is in science disciplines. I mean, that is intrinsic to the biological sciences. And any science that is experimental, where your experimental apparatus is basically drives the results from your analysis and drives the data activity associated with the system under test. So those would be early stage activities that you would look at, and then you would to fully flesh out that response to that question, you would then need to kind of think through all of the other implications and application environments where knowledge sharing would be fundamental to how you progressed it. So I appreciate the question. We're right at the end, in front of the close of the event. So I mean,
and Jim, we did get some other questions. So if you're okay with that, I'll ask them to forward them, and maybe you can forward them to the panel because they are asking you to solve world peace on some of these questions here.
Okay. All
Gentlemen,
right.
thank you
Well,
so much for your kind attention this afternoon. We really appreciate it. And welcome Dr. Wang back into the session. Hello,
Just
Rich.
one note. I was there all the time, but you don't see me. You didn't see
You were
me.
hiding the whole time. Is that what you're saying,
Hey,
sir?
Richard.
Yeah, I think the attendees, I saw the other attendees as well. So it's not 0 attendees.
No, we had 150 at one
I
point.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent.
That's very good. Okay,
Great.
who's on make a note?
well,
Thank
Rich,
you,
thank you
Kelly.
very much for joining, and good to see you. And we will now transition as our conference chair and founder has come on the line here. Thank you for joining.
Yes.
And we'll make
Stay
this
with us
formal.
for town
I will.
hall.
I will say that for all of those still in the session, we will be looking at this. I expect that Rich, Stu, and Robert will want to continue with this type of a topic in next year in some capacity. So we'll continue to look at this. So with that, we'll officially close this session. I'll thank everyone and move to Rich, over to you.